For being here, and I want to say as few words as possible so that I can hand things off to our student presenters here. But I do want to say how this all came to pass. First of all, the work that I do in international law it relates very directly to many events surrounding the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, the work that I do in recognition of states and governments, in international human rights, in international humanitarian law, and international criminal law, and questions of the use of force. This is all sort of a perfect storm for the operation of the international legal doctrines associated with this, and so I've become deeply enmeshed in the study of the former Yugoslavia, even though I am not an area studies person and do not speak the local languages. My direct involvement in Yugoslavia is really owing to a great man, a former colleague of mine, whom some of you knew, Otto Feinstein, and I want to particularly dedicate this moment to Otto. Otto left us in 2003, but Otto was the person who, along with colleagues in the former Yugoslavia, helped to establish this divided societies course at the Inter-University Center in Dubrovnik. The idea of the divided societies course is to bring people together for a week to 10 days every year to talk about questions of ethnic conflict and cooperation, focused largely on the former Yugoslavia, but also with application to issues the world around. People from all over the world come to Dubrovnik for this short course, which involves graduate and undergraduate students from Europe and elsewhere. And we've had the opportunity over many years to bring over 100 students to the Divided Societies course. My colleague Kevin Deegan-Krause and I did this for 10 runs a decade ago. And I resumed it this last May because we were able to get support from the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program. This was an opportunity for students to compete for research grants from that entity, and happily, because of the strength of their applications, Dalia, John, and Sheham all won these research grants and were able to accompany me to the former Yugoslavia. The trip entails first the Inter-University Center in Dubrovnik, Croatia, which is down here, and then a trip through Bosnia and Herzegovina to the cities of Mostar and Sarajevo, and then on to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia located in The Hague in the Netherlands. And so you may hear more aspects of that trip from the three presentations. But I don't want to delay this any further. I would ordinarily want to give a long preamble about the issues of the breakup of Yugoslavia, but I think you're going to hear a lot about that, and we'll perhaps be able to fill in various ways in the midst of all of that. We're going to be hearing about issues of collective memory, about issues of political entrepreneurship and demagoguery, and issues of electoral structure, and how those all contributed in various ways to the depth and intensity of the conflicts, the multi-sided conflicts that occurred in the course of the 1990s in Yugoslavia and that still have an overhang to this day. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Dalia Ibrahim to talk about collective memory.
Thank you, thank you. Hello, my name is Dalia. I'll kind of just get right into it. I think it's better said than explained. But so I did my research on collective memory, and I really want to start with after any kind of atrocity or a tragedy, society is often pushed to understand what happened, and in the depths of trauma and grief, those truths can kind of be used and manipulated by political leaders. And so I kind of wanted to explore that. I think the Yugoslavia does, the former Yugoslavia has, gives a good, region to explore this. And so, let's see if this works. Okay, perfect. So I begin with formal history. So the expectation is that there is an objective truth, but in reality, there is no, it's really very difficult to get an omnipresent view of any kind of situation. That's not to say that there is no objective truth, but rather in perceiving it, you are adding your perception. And so I come to define formal history rather as a process that attempts to grasp the complexity of a situation without, political agendas or identity politics, irrespective, like I said, of communal identities, and it occurs among respected historians, state actors, and other dedicated individuals. So that's how we'll come to understand formal history. And a note on semantics, it's important to note here, like formal does not mean being taught in education. That's, I think, how we colloquially understand formal. But as you'll come to see, and I'll come to show, depending on the level of freedom in a society, educational apparatuses can actually be manipulated to display a certain narrative or political agenda. And that is very much the case in Yugoslavia. And so I actually explored, researcher Tamara Trask did some research. She wanted to explore how the narrative is changed across generations, and so she really explored 3 eras, and she focused on 8th grade textbooks because that's when they focus on World War II, in Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia. So she did the Socialist era, the early 1970s until the 1980s, the transitional era, 1980s to 1990s, and we put democratic in quotes here, the new democratic era, which is the 2000 to present. The general conclusions are, in the socialist era, in Tito's Yugoslavia, there was a strong sentiment for brotherhood and unity, not a lot of focus on individual national identities. In the transitional era, you start to see more of this focus come out in each country. And in the new democratic era, as with, the late 90s, early 2000s, there's a lot of emotionally charged rhetoric in these books and not all too accurate once she comes. We'll explore those in a little bit greater detail later. But so to kind of delve into collective memory. So collective memory then stands not necessarily in opposition to formal history, but in, contrast, it's comprised of really 3 entities: a body of knowledge, some set idea, an attribute, a distinctive image of the group, and then lastly, and I think the most important part of collective memory, is the continual process of evolution and understanding between generations. And so I wanted to bring up the importance of language, again, semantics. Really, the way that something is, even the way you just talk about something can change the way that you view something. And so they did a research study in 1974. They had students watch an automobile accident. And they asked the students after, they said, at what speed did the 2 cars smash into each other? And the students were like, 40 miles per hour, 50 miles per hour. Then they asked the next group of students, at what speed did the cars hit each other? And the students recalled 30 miles per hour, 25. And when asked those 2 groups, was there any glass on the scene, those that were asked whether the cars hit each other or smashed each other, they reported remembering glass where there was none, whereas those that were asked what speed the cars hit each other don't remember seeing glass. And so it's just kind of just trying to reinforce how easily and malleable our memory is, how easily it can be recoded just through even just semantics, but more importantly through, if you add on rhetoric and sentiment and, culture and identity, all these other really big factors that contribute. And so the differentiation, collective memory really heavily involves this identity formation, often remembering in the surface of who we are and who we are not. Novik, some of the research I did, he spoke on how to understand something historically is to understand it in its complexity, but to understand or to see something as collective memory, it simplifies things. It doesn't leave room for ambiguity. It's important to note here that collective memory does not always operate in opposition to formal history. Sometimes the formal history of a nation does indeed coincide with the collective memory of a certain group. However, due to emotions and other factors, that's typically not the case, especially with grief and trauma. Also, national collective memory is not always negative, though we do often talk about this because often it is the product of war. But there are examples of positive national identities, as you see in the U.S., the beacon of democracy. So things of that nature, it's not impossible, and I wanted to make a note of that. It's also important to notice that an important part of collective memory is victimization. And victimization is really twofold in that it's not just the consequence of something happening, but it's also the social construction of that happening. And it's really 3 parts. It's rooted in the realization of a harm, whether it's experienced directly or indirectly. And then it's not merely enough for something to have happened to you or to someone you love. It's also a matter of having that recognized on a social level, and then furthermore, once you have received that status of victimhood, it's often, and you say this, hesitantly in a way, only because I think that a lot of what has happened was very tragic. But it is, in some ways, victimhood is comfortable. So once you reach a status, people attempt to maintain it. So yes, it's often an effective performance of how far we can expand we, how far what happened to us can become a collective identity. And so my research really, I used 2 World War II examples of Jasenovac and Bleiburg to kind of go into what occurred. So history is across the board manipulated, and collective memories are formed. And so it's not, Yugoslavia is not an anomaly, but some distinctive qualities of the region, or is that it provides multiple cases to study within a similar context. And they have a strong tradition and preference for military heroism. And a lot of the Balkan states were actually created and were the immediate byproducts of war. So that brings us to our trip. I took this picture in Dubrovnik. We were there May 6th and 13th at the University Center, where we went into a bunch of topics of old and new nationalism. This is just a few of those that were presented to us. The one that stood out to me was New Nationalism and the Standardization of Memory by Leah David, which was cool to meet these professors from all across the region and have the opportunity to engage in them. These topics were specifically nationalism, but they were very interesting. We also visited Mostar in Sarajevo. I took this picture of Mostar Bridge, and this experience, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. We visited the Srebrenica Memorial, which I didn't take Srebrenica as an example in my research. It didn't feel right. It's far more recent, but the tragedies don't hold the same manipulative power as Jasenovac and Bleiburg, and I'll kind of go into that. But we did go. So a little bit about what I studied. So Jasenovac, really to understand it, we start with the independent state of Croatia, which is a puppet government created by Nazi Germany, led by Ante Pavelic. The Ustasha were a fascist, racist, unpleasant to say the least, group that committed massive atrocities. And so they really wanted to promote the Aryan. And Aryan here we use loosely only because they're all white, but for them the definition was more of a political association. So they were committed to cleanse the population, and in doing so subjected Serbs and other ethnic minorities to massive atrocities. Jasenovac was just one of many. But it was more of anything a killing camp, a death camp for those who were seen as impure. And here's where we see the important role of collective memory is in the manipulation of numbers. So according to the Yugoslavian military encyclopedia, we see 500 to 600,000. Later it was inflated to 700,000 victims. Later that was reinterpreted to be understood as 700,000 Serbian victims. And then later, it got to the point where they were like, yeah, it can't even be counted how many victims. And so you see this oversimplification and this exaggeration. It kind of brings the question of intent. Are we, looking to achieve numbers for the sake of commemoration, of reconciliation? Or are we looking to use these numbers as a way to manipulate or, use it for political gain? A lot of the sentiment behind this is Serbian nationalism. It's an opportunity to reinforce this sentiment amongst the groups that Serbians were the constant victims of atrocity, and that they were in the threat of physical annihilation, therefore unifying an offensive front. And we see this really come to fruition in the film Istina, which is translated to The Truth, which was a film presented by the Serbian Radical Party, in which the Alexander Vučić, the 5th president of Serbia, at the time was reading a letter to the crowd from Dr. Vojislav, who is the leader of the Serbian Radical Party. And he's reading this letter from The Hague. He wrote this letter in The Hague as he's being tried for war crimes. But of course, he had the time to tell, of course, the Serbian people that they are at the threat of annihilation once again. People are coming to attack them, and that they must brand together. And so you see a very charged, emotional rhetoric in the showing of this film. And then the film, I watched only a bit of it because I couldn't get through it all. It was just so graphic and very narrow in its presentation. And so that kind of brings us to the other, narrative. Here is Bleiburg, which at the end of World War II, when Germany was expected to surrender, the military at the time, controlled by Ante Pavlovich, he thought, what better way to avoid punishment than to escape to Austria? And in his attempt to escape, thinking that he would receive like amnesty in a way, the British actually forfeited those groups to the Yugoslav partisans, who then committed also very ungood atrocities. And so they ended up lining these prisoners of war and these people who had surrendered, one by one, tied them, shot them into anti-tank trenches built by the Germans during the war, and covered up the body. And actually, those bodies were not discovered until '99, when they tried to build a roadway in Slovenia. And so you see this massive just cover up of atrocities, and it's a back and forth game of who did what with who for how many muffins. And so you see here the number of victims being manipulated. You start off with 190,000 to 200,000 Croatian fighters, to at some point 600,000. And again, Bleiburg serves as this symbol of a communist oppression at the hands of the government, serves as a sort of counter-narrative to Jasenovac. With the election of Franjo Tuđman, you see that, and he was a historian himself, and he actually wrote the preamble to the Croatian constitution. So he begins to downplay Jasenovac, and as you see, they downgraded the Jasenovac Memorial to the nature park, and they began to cut its funding. And so you kind of see how each state was able to also affect the others' collective memory of these atrocities. And so, during Tito's Yugoslavia, this maybe was able to stay underground for quite some time. But as he passed and, things started to not go so well, you see that these past atrocities start to become reoccurring. And then, as we know, the Balkan War happens, tragedies are committed, and again, these national and ethnic sentiments are brought up, which brings us to, okay, so what do we do now? We've got groups of people living side by side in a place that does not really allow them to express their frustrations. And so I really wanted to explore, my main focuses were collective memory, but also transitional justice. How do we get groups out of this, and what can we do to help and fix and kind of rework. And so there's really two ways to go about transitional justice. There's truth and reconciliation councils. Some are just truth councils. Yugoslavia, when they did theirs, purposely did not do a reconciliation. That's like an added complexity. But there are also trials and other judicial avenues, ways that you can go about fixing things. And so some characterizations of these commissions, they focus on the past. They're typically temporary in duration. Usually a final report is given. And they're typically established and authorized by the state. Really, truth commissions, like we talked about truth, and I go a bit more about it in my paper, truth commissions can only really reduce the number of lies, so it's very hard to get to an optimist truth. So we get to the other side of transitional justice and its tribunals and trials. So others include instituting or upholding amnesties, providing reparations, or utilizing illustrations. But the contemporary conception is dominated by punishment, retribution, prosecution, and justice, which brings us to the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia, which we had the honor of visiting. So ICTY is a court of law established by the UN, jurisdiction over really 4 clusters of crimes, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, violations of the laws and customs of war, genocide, and crimes against humanity. An important differentiation in ICTY is between genocide and crimes against humanity. It's that we see too that these crimes not just be tried as crimes against humanity, but to their utmost level of genocide, which unfortunately was not the case. They were not able to, which upset a lot of people. Total of 161 indictments. Critics have questioned whether the tribunal has actually exacerbated conflict or whether it was able to bring any form of reconciliation. Polls in the 2 countries show that there's negative reaction to the tribunal amongst both Serbs and Croats, though Serbs were 68% of those indicted were Serbian. Many see this as reflecting bias, but again, the ICTY's response was, well, no, it's just proportional to the crimes that were committed. My response to the critique was, and where I kind of got my sentiment was that you can't really expect everything to happen from a court. You know, it's not enough. It's not enough to suppose that they will deliver justice, but rather we should measure each case on its own merit. We should judge the work of the tribunal by its legal expertise, not necessarily by the political outcome. And so, what I really took from the entirety of the trip and really our experience at ICTY was it's not enough to do judicial avenues, and it's not economics. There is no trickle down or conciliation. It won't happen from above. It needs to happen on the ground with the people from the root. But this is also a difficult task, as many people, as we know, trauma, it's very heavy. And so a lot of what I came to conclude was the need for not only judicial avenues, but also those truth and reconciliation methods on the floor, on the ground with those ethnic groups. So, more later, but that's it.
John Sedarous will tell us
Yay.
about political entrepreneurship.
I will.
Alright, thank you guys all for coming today. My name is John Sedarous. My research was focused on political entrepreneurship and particularly how it can be analyzed in the former Yugoslavia and current America. I want to start by talking a little bit about political entrepreneurship and how I use it in this sense. Really I identify political entrepreneurship to be a political revolution centered around the individual, and what I mean by that is it's a certain individual leader that comes to a group of people who have at least perceived themselves to be disgruntled or disadvantaged or otherwise persecuted by some other force or group. And this leader pretty much present themselves as something different from the other leaders that are currently in power or have been in power before that have been ineffective in dealing with these issues. And so the best way for them to do that, at least from a historical standpoint, has been through the use of populism. And so I identify populism based on the research that I understood at the Inter-University Center in Dubrovnik to be an unmediated relationship between the leader and the base. So essentially, the goal of the political entrepreneur is to convince the people that he's going to remove all the structures and barriers that are in between them and the government, and in between them and the changes they want to see. And so I found this to be most prevalent in the cases of Slobodan Milosevic and Donald Trump. So I kind of want to start with Milosevic. So Milosevic was born on August 20th, 1941 in Požarevac. I hope I'm saying that correctly. It's about 75 miles south of the capital of Belgrade, of the Serbian capital of Belgrade. And he had a lot of early communist influences in his life. His father abandoned him and his mother when he was a child, and his mother was a staunch communist, so he had a lot of that influence growing up. In high school, he joined the Communist Party, and from there, he went on the University of Belgrade's law faculty and became the president of the Communist Party organization. And most important part about this is that this is where he would meet Ivan Stambolic, who ended up being one of the most powerful figures that he would meet in his life. The main reason being that he would climb the political ladder in Serbia rung by rung after Stambolic until they neared the top with each other, but this would not have been possible without the key media connections they had. Milosevic in particular had a very good relationship with Zvibrad Minovic. He was the editor of Politika, which was Serbia's most influential newspaper at the time. And given the limits of technology during this time, the Politika newspaper was probably the most powerful way for people to receive their flow of information. And so in combining those two things, the political connections and the media connections he had, he was able to make his way up through the ranks of power in the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, which was the most powerful political party in Yugoslavia during this time. And so what he did was, once him and Stambolic had neared the top, Milosevic worked to install people in place who supported his policies. So he put his sympathizers, people who thought like him, in power of the party's commissions dealing with political, social, and economic issues. So he pretty much tried to give himself a little bit of influence in every operation of government, right? So, yes. So even though Milosevic had done a lot to really put himself on and to make his name known in Yugoslavia, it wouldn't be until April 20th, 1987 when the legend of Milosevic would really be born. And what I mean by this is Milosevic had not really, he was politically salient because the media covered the LCY so closely, but it wasn't really until this moment when he was sent to the province of Kosovo, which had a lot of ethnic tension going on behind it, that he would really become as popular as he would be. And so what ended up happening was he was sent to Kosovo to mediate a disagreement between the Serbians and the Albanians in Kosovo. And his instructions were not to take sides, it was more to just go there and keep the peace. What he does instead is he agrees to meet with the nationalists, the Serbian nationalists, on that Friday, which was April 20th, 1987. And, well, let me just show you what happened.
Tanku, čekaj,
Tyren Shehem'in ve karakteristi.
For Milosevic, this was the moment of decision. What Milosevic said next would change everything. That night, Serb television created the Milosevic legend. Serbia saw him embrace the cause of the Serbs in Kosovo.
Mi smo taj izveštaj pravili za svoje redovne emisije, mi imamo 3 kanala i on je bio vrlo zadovoljan tim putem.
So, essentially this was all at that meeting. As the meeting was concluding, Milosevic was walking out. A brawl ensued between the Kosovo police and the Serbian nationalists that were present. And so, the Serbian nationalists come to Milosevic, they say, they're beating us again. That was his response, and that's what the media really used to instill the legend of Milosevic in the public eye. So after that moment, everything would change, nothing would be the same. So Milosevic here saw the power that was to be had in sympathizing with the Serbians as a Serb. So Milosevic goes into this situation and he understands the political stakes, and what he does is he sympathizes with them, he says to them, you will not be beaten again. And this resonates with them so strongly because they had for many years felt disparaged, not just by other groups, but by the federal system of Yugoslavia. And so that's why you see Milosevic's stance really evolve from, he starts here by saying, I'm going to defend the Kosovo Serbs, and then it kind of evolves more into, he sees that there's large groups of Serbs living in scattered all throughout Yugoslavia. And so his idea was, if I can convince these people that I'm going to be their defender, I'm going to be their champion, they're going to support me because I'm not like the elites, I am one of them. And that was really the image of himself that he tried to implant in their minds, and that's why the media's use was so powerful. So, as you might expect, his fame grew rapidly, especially in rural areas. The urban areas, they were more progressive at the time, didn't really accept his message as readily, but the rural areas where people really harbored these sentiments for a long time and were just waiting for the right avenue, the right politician to express it through, that's when it really, that's how it really caught fire with him. So, this was all in late 1987, and what ends up happening is after that footage is played on Serbian media, the Serbian media starts a defamatory onslaught against the Albanians, pretty much saying that the Albanians were committing crimes of rape, murder, arson, vandalism, And so it really inflamed ethnic tensions that were already not too great. And so Dragiša Pavlović, the head of the Belgrade Party organization, he calls for a meeting with the editors, and he instructs them to relax their anti-Albanian narratives. Milosevic finds out about this that night. He's having dinner with the editor of Politica, Minovic, and he dictates an article to Minovic to be published in the next day's paper, essentially saying that Pavlović was trying to divide the Serbian party. He didn't represent Serbian interests. And this was really important because Pavlović was very closely tied to the president of the LCY, Stambolic. And so as a result, both Stambolic and Pavlovic's popularity plummets in the coming months. It got to the point where Stambolic's image was being cropped out of media photos. They weren't running any stories about him. And he ultimately was fired by a 6-1 vote of the LCY. And so this opens the door for Milosevic to step in and become president of the LCY. And that's when he starts disseminating his ideology throughout Yugoslavia. So this really worked most effectively in Vojvodina and Montenegro, the reason being that their economic situations in those areas were very bad. And so people were very frustrated and were looking for some sort of change. And so Milosevic comes into Vojvodina, for example, this was in fall of 1988, and he tells the people, you know, these elites have not been serving you, this is why the economy is so bad, this is why you're being economically taken advantage of by the upper class. His message spreads like wildfire there. I believe it was 70,000 protesters ran into the capital to demand a change in government, and that's what happened. The Vojvodina government actually ends up collapsing, and because it was a province of Serbia, Serbia gains control over Vojvodina, so Milosevic wins that part of the territory. Now, a few months later, in January of 1989, in Montenegro, Milosevic does something very similar. Montenegro had an unemployment rate of over 25%. So again, people are very unhappy, looking for a change. Milosevic comes in, promises them the changes they want to see, and once again, the protesters flood into the capital. They start protesting, and the government collapses. It's taken over by a puppet government, which swears its loyalty to Milosevic, saying that Montenegro and Serbia would act as one moving forward. And so now I just kind of want to summarize, because that's really when Milosevic's power had peaked. He gained the territorial expansion he needed, didn't need any military action to do it, just to spread his word and let the grassroots movement do its work. And so, just to kind of recap, the way that he did all this was, one, he needed the relationship with Stambolic, who he climbed behind before. Once they got to the top, he pushed him off and took his place. After that, he would vilify the minority groups and the Albanians, and pretty much expanded that list to include whoever was convenient for him, whoever he needed to really go after. That was who, you know, was against Serbian interests and was an enemy to the Serbian people. And so that's how he really garnered the support of his target base. He used the media, especially Politica and the televised media, as you saw in the video clip, to control the political narrative, incite fear-mongering, and really create a sense of insecurity within the Serbian people, to convince them that if you don't support Milosevic, XXX is going to happen to you, and you don't want that to happen because these people are a threat to our society, our culture, and pretty much any other bad threat you could think of. That's what Milosevic used to foster his own popularity. So the ultimate result was that while his individual power skyrocketed, it set the stage for ethnic civil war, so it didn't really last for too long. So now I kind of want to transition into a little bit about Donald Trump and how this framework kind of applies to him. And so, you know, I'm sure over the past 2 years we've all heard more than enough about Mr. Trump, so I will spare you all the details. I will kind of work backwards in my analysis. So what I found was Trump used a very similar strategy to Milosevic. The only main difference really is how they came up. And, you know, we all know that Trump had his platform as a celebrity billionaire. But from that point, what does Trump do? Now that he has the ability to connect to the people, his main rallying points were the Mexican, Central American immigrants are coming in from the South. They're destroying our culture, destroying our society, taking our jobs, committing all these crimes. We're letting these people in without any kinds of checks. We need to stop this. We need to tighten our immigration laws, build the wall. And what does he use to disseminate this message? The media. So, as we all know, he launches an attack on the press, uses his Twitter to directly connect with the people, and the result was that his individual power skyrocketed, but the rest really remains to be seen. So in terms of vilifying minority groups, probably the strongest undertone that I found in my research was a strong hint of anti-cosmopolitanism. What I mean by that is anti-cosmopolitanism really refers to the idea that certain groups of people are disadvantaging us, and because they live amongst us and because they're using our resources, these people are more of a detriment than a gain to society. And Trump really presents himself as one of the people that is part of the true Americans, right? Not all these elites, not all these minorities, not all these people of color that are coming in and destroying our society. Trump is a true American, and he's going to go represent the Americans in office. He's going to drain the swamp in Washington, take out all these elites that have been misrepresenting the people and ignoring their interests. Main target, as we know, Central American Mexican immigrants coming in from the South. He also targets Muslim immigrants. He claims that, he literally is quoted as being said, when Mexico sends us their people, they're not sending us their best, they're sending us their drug dealers, rapists, murderers, etc., etc. And so his main rallying point was to build the wall and make Mexico pay for it. And as ludicrous as that may sound, somehow it worked, right? And so how did it work? Well, like I said, it's a pretty ludicrous proposal, so the media had a field day with him for it, right? But luckily for Trump, he doesn't believe in anything the media says. Everything that the NY Times, BBC News, ABC, CBS, CNN says, it's all fake news. They are the enemy of the American people. And so by doing so, he redirects his supporters' attention from all these news outlets to Fox News, because Fox News was the only station that really covered him in such a positive tone. And so in doing that, he was really able to shift the attention away from them and direct the political narrative in the direction that he wanted it to go in. And one of the most important things, and a lot of people didn't realize this until after the election, was how he used Twitter. So in a study conducted by University of Oslo in Norway, they found that about only 1/3 of Trump's tweets really conformed to political standards and norms, and the rest of his tweets were very impersonal, which led people to believe that his tweets were a true reflection of what he believed and what he thought and what he was going to do, rather than something that was just written by a campaign staffer for PR purposes. And so this really serves to help establish that unmediated relationship between the people and the leader. And that was one of the biggest things that he went after, is that he realized that the people that were supporting him, they felt that they had been ignored by Washington for so long, and he was going to be the way out. He was going to be the difference. He was going to be the person that did it differently than all those other people before him and currently serving. So, just to kind of conclude on the Trump and Milosevic comparison, again, very similar strategy in terms of establishing a platform. Once you have that platform, you go and you pick a minority group that your targeted support group has been harboring sentiments about or has had past tensions with. After that, you use the media to really press this issue, and then from that point on, you kind of let everything play out, because he really just needed, in both cases, they just needed to set the stage and let everything follow suit. And like I said, we're not really sure what the consequences of Trump's presidency will be. I do have some general idea based on what he's already done. So obviously Supreme Court implications. We all know that he's already nominated and had confirmed 2 justices in Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. They are both conservative justices, pro-presidential power justices. And what's even more concerning is that the 2 oldest served members of the court right now, they're both Democrats. So especially if he gets reelected, Trump may very well have a chance at 2 more nominations. Another thing is, I believe the wealth gap will expand as a result of his policies. Trump is a very well-known fan of former President Ronald Reagan, and who's probably most famously known for his Reaganomics policy. I'm also an economics major, so I was kind of looking into this in one of my macroeconomics classes. What we found is that the Gini coefficient right here, which is a measure of the wealth gap, so essentially a number of 0 would indicate absolute evenly divided wealth. A number of 1 would indicate that one person controls 100% of the wealth. The Gini coefficient remained somewhat steady until Ronald Reagan was elected president, when it spiked up because of Reaganomics. Lastly, environmental deterioration is definitely a threat too. He's pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord. he's cut EPA funding and he's rolled back environmental regulations. So that's all I have for you guys. Thank you very much for your attention. And,
And finally, Sheham Saif will talk with us about the role of the electoral structure in the former Yugoslavia and particularly Croatia.
If we can have the light off, only because appreciate it. We look at a lot of maps and polls for this one, so it'd be good for you guys to see. Hello, my name is Sheham Saif, and today we're going to look at Croatia's road to independence and the rise of Franjo Tuđman. Okay, so before I get into this, I just first of all wanted to tell you guys a little bit of my time there in Croatia, which is where my talk will be about today. So to your right over here, we actually have the sign for the Inter-University Center in Dubrovnik, where we actually had our Divided Societies Conference. It kind of helped us understand the politics in the region, and more importantly, visiting Croatia and the area in the Balkan Peninsula kind of helped us talk to people and see how they kind of look at the history and how they perceive the kind of ethnic tensions and all that stuff. So it was really important that we visited there. It really helped kind of, I guess, help us understand, not only just help us understand the region and its politics, but also helped us understand like how we can relate our issues and internal things to it. So this is actually the building that we had the conference in every day. It was like my favorite place to be. It was really beautiful and we had great views. That's the front steps, and that's just us enjoying the city outside. And also thanks to Dr. Roth, because that's the way we made it there. Today we're going to be talking about Croatia and the road to independence, but we're going to do this by kind of examining the relationship between the configuration of the electoral processes and how it gave rise to ethno-national political entrepreneurship. Specifically, I'll be looking at Croatia's election in 1990 and the rise of Franjo Tuđman, as Dalia talked about, who was not a dictator, but I guess an authoritative figure in the Croatian politics. So to interpret Croatia's ability to kind of stage their independence movement in the 1990s, we have to first kind of examine the mechanisms with which the former Yugoslavia operated its federation for nearly 74 years. So the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, as I'll just refer to as Yugoslavia, was an aftermath of World War II. It was a consociation of states, which meant that power sharing and their conception of territories was kind of seen as an association of an association. So in other words, it was kind of just an understanding of the republics that they kind of maintained their own territorial boundary but worked within a communist system. Equally, since this was a complex kind of setup, it also meant that their procedures, electoral procedure, was also kind of modeled that way. It was very complex and difficult. So this is how their federal election happened. And just to quickly give you guys a view of how complex it is, they have their local and labor organizations elect a commune level assembly, and then that assembly then elects some of their members to go to the provincial and republic level, and then that assembly elects 2 positions for the federal assembly. So you have like the federal chamber and then the chamber for republics and provinces. So when Yugoslavia was made, it coalesced into 6 different republics and 2 different territories. Ethnic tension was always kind of below the surface for these regions. I mean, it dated back to 1839 with the Battle of Kosovo. So you had ethnic tensions, but they never flared. Especially after when Yugoslavia was made, it was important to repress those tensions just to operate the republics. Nevertheless, like I said, it was important to suppress these ethnic hostility in order to make this work. Political equality as well in the region was kind of, it wasn't one person, one vote majority, as that kind of made way for a predatory majority. They needed to coexist, and to do that, they needed to first recognize the ethnic groups within the territorial boundary, and they also needed to have a system that worked where they would acknowledge all the groups and make sure that none of the groups formed a majority, and if they did, it would be only a temporary majority. So since the Constitution bound ethnic people and people of territories, the unity of Yugoslavia was marked by this kind of practicing balancing power between the Federation and the Republic through a system of overlapping rights, responsibilities, and powers on checks. So Yugoslavia kind of emphasized their communist self-management system, which was stressed things like functioning organizations within the territory, and it also afforded republics budgetary and administrative autonomy, so they felt like they had power over things that were going on within their territory. It also decentralized a lot of the markets, specifically after the World War when the economies wasn't doing really well, which also kind of helped bolster people's view on the state of Yugoslavia. So the federal responsibility was things like dealing with foreign powers, employment, roads, as well as kind of the external market. They sought to have important and distinct relationships with the Western market so they can bolster their trade and economic exports. Okay, perfect. In addition to kind of maintaining and fortifying the health of the economic system that they had, it was crucial that their leadership was also looked upon as important for the republics. So they felt the Federation of Yugoslavia kind of pushed for self-governance and autonomy for the region and their right to self-determination in a multinational state. It was contested, however, whether the question of their right to succession fell within the jurisdiction of the republics or the Federation, because it was written in a tricky fashion in their constitution, and it was contradictory in that at first it provided the right to secede, but in a different revision of the Constitution of Yugoslavia, it required that any changes of external boundaries must be agreed by all 6 republics. So that kind of set the fundamental question, that was like the fundamental stage for all the republics when Yugoslavia began their dissolution process of, okay, where do we stand in terms of self-determination, self-sovereignty, and how do we claim our individual sovereignty there as well? So here's a little composition map of, here's a composition map of Yugoslavia. So we see that Yugoslavia was kind of accommodating systematically to facilitate internal stability through how they I guess how they, not gerrymandered, but how they kind of shaped ethnic groups, and specifically ethnic groups in territories that were not their own. So we see that the Yugoslavia territory was home to ethnic groups that have stemmed from years and years. We had Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, and in 1936, Muslims were seen as a specific ethnic group. So their community of ethnic group was either diverse and dispersed within the region, and many large sorts and population of ethno-national communities didn't exist always within their own ethnic homeland, but existed outside of their ethnic homeland. So basically Yugoslavia was a territory of minorities, and the rights of the people, regardless of their ethnicity, was protected under Yugoslavia's constitution. So even with the political and economic structure in Yugoslavia measured to neutralize these ethnic tension, this nature of just power sharing that I'm telling you guys about, the federal and republic system, this formula kind of revolved around this constant push and pulling of powers, and that was not always meant to work between the Federation and Republic. It was not bound to be sustainable, specifically if things from the external world happened within Yugoslavia, and we kind of see that transpire because by 1970, there's elements that compromise the stability and the security of the federation. We had the world economic conditions take a downturn. We had disinterest and disinvestment from Western communities as they turned their attention into Eastern markets. We had a lack of capital inflow in Croatia as well, just a looming balance of payment debt crisis, which basically meant that Croatia couldn't afford the capital for investment to get their debt paid off. So under the aegis of their fourth and final constitution, we see that it elaborated the electoral representation and complex procedures that kind of expanded the role of each republic. So this process of kind of fragmentation exacerbated each republic's motivation to kind of mobilize their priorities in kind of safeguarding their economic, their domestic, and really their ethnic commitment to their own republic. And we see that this relationship further eroded between the federal and the republican relationship, and it kind of began when it was like a natural process for republics to start consolidating and regionalizing more power as time went on and as they were already given that autonomy to begin with from Yugoslavia. So in addition to severing political ties, there was also decent effort into disintegrating cultural ties. Yugoslavia gave republics the autonomy to make their own and model their own education system and their own cultural system. So essentially, all Yugoslav means of communication began phasing out of all republics. And by 1980, the death of Marshal Tito kind of marks and cements a symbolic end to the communist rule there, which was a long 72 years. And so with their internal position and their constitutional and social order and their conception of citizenship all in question, all the eyes were basically now on the republics to decide whether they wanted to stay a unified state within Yugoslavia. So in the Belgrade capital, we kind of seen that Croatia had a dwindling electoral population there, and that kind of further promoted the disengagement of Croatians from Yugoslav politics. And by 1970, the size of the Croatian constituents in Yugoslavia either began aging or just simply dwindling. As we see here, one of the most remarkable things about, by 1981, only 14% of Yugoslav communists were Croats, and then we see that 20% of Yugoslav's Communist Party were citizens of Croatia at a time when Croatia had only 20% of the Yugoslav population. And that kind of shows us that they didn't really have that much incentive to be in Yugoslav's federation, because not only didn't have much representation to begin with, but they were already given so much autonomy that they were already starting to run things on their own. So this kind of, this given political context, it's kind of difficult to say when the democratization process of each republic started, but it did take place between April and through December of 1989 and 1990, when the collapse of the Yugoslav party basically cemented any idea of having another federation. So as the republic by republic elections occurred, no one actually really bothered to push this idea or this question of whether or not the federation wanted to maintain a unified state under Yugoslavia. Presumably, a lot of republics would have just said yes, but if it wasn't in the cards, no republic wanted to be left out of the kind of situation of whether or not they kind of want to use this time to settle their own territory, settle their own ethno-national state. So it kind of presented a collective action problem, because no one really wanted to take the first step in proclaiming their republic, because that would have brought on a lot of onslaught, a lot of international humdrum and all that stuff. So it really was a question of who can take the first step and who couldn't. So it wasn't that easy, and taking the step to move into their own individual republic was kind of difficult, especially because it was costly. Everyone understood the terms of secession in terms of ethno-national identities, and no nation wanted to be left out of that. So the prisoner's dilemma was kind of a question of secession, and that was kind of bad timing because at that time the popular will was volatile. People were merely reacting to anticipated reactions of other republics, so which therefore increased and heightened political anxiety within the region, which further kind of pushed the course of democratization within each state. We have individual republics that were not incentivized again, but Slovenia and Croatia kind of were in a unique position to be the first ones to declare independence. So Croatia specifically, they had great regional ties with the West. They were culturally tied with the West. They also spent a lot of time building intensive relationships with the Western economy, and they also naturally just fit into the economic system of the European community, and as did Slovenia. So there wasn't that much threat of economic downfall. If they fell, they at least had a community that could bring them into their economic system. So competitive multi-party elections that took place became kind of the conduit for each individual republic to profess their sovereignty and assert its majority nation on the grounds of their rights to self-determination. So threat of ethnic clash began as John went over with Milosevic. He started a kind of political machination with the Serbs in his community, and that started threatening other republics to begin and bound their own territories. Croatia was kind of known as a silent republic by Yugoslavian media actually in the 1980s because it seemed relatively peaceful, but there was always kind of ethnic tension below the surfaces of Croatia. And so Croatian nationalism never really died in World War II. So this is actually Tudjman, and he's traveling to England. And so this breakup kind of started reviving frustrations of veterans from the Croatian Springs who've been silent since 1936. And so Franjo Tudjman, who was a war veteran and a Croatian dissident, he actually went to jail twice under Tito's rule. He hammered out a program and declared the ethnic Croatian movement. And 4 months later, even with police threats, him and 48 other members presided over a Croatian Democratic Union, which they did by holding a Congress meeting. Soon after the party's inauguration, Tudjman wasted no time in garnering support for Croatia within and outside of their homeland. So he knew there were a lot of pockets of ethnic Croatian groups in different parts of the territory. So even before him getting into any formal office, he kind of began rallying and galvanizing support. He was really popular in Toronto, in Canada, because there was a there was a group of ethnic Croatians there. He was able to garner money and support from there. He went to the US, Kosovo, Montenegro, all those places. And at that time, he also released a declaration that highlighted his disposition with nationalism. So he concentrated on things like there's a demography need to kind of specialize and take pride in the Croat blood. He also wanted to rival the news agency that they had in Belgrade and make one for Croatia. And he was also particular about the national anthem, and that was actually a big part of his campaign, was changing that. So he basically recruited purely based on the national question, and that was what he used to invigorate people to vote. So Tudjman's strategy, as we see here, to claim support, he focused on securing relationships with militant right-wing groups in the Communist Party's anti-communist right party as well in other regions. So he just made sure to get political support, but only on the nationalist questions from other places, knowing that it was now as it pertained to them as more than now than ever, because the question of nationalhood and statehood was kind of important, and there was not really an answer to what was going to happen next. So nearly 1 year after his clandestine operations of going and getting support and garnering support all over the place, he ended up having he ended up becoming the foremost rival of the Communist Party. And later he kind of declared that he would run. So I'm going to go over this quickly, we are running out of time. So Croatia kind of ran in a tricameral parliament. And it wasn't that different from the way Yugoslavia was run. So we see that, So Croatia adopted amendments to their constitution, but they also passed many passages of law, basically. However, one thing they did miss out on was that they left the parliamentary system the same as they did back in Yugoslavia. And this was kind of a problem because the Communist Party used things like first past the post electoral process to maintain power, only because they foresaw being the better organized party and holding the power on the basis of their structure. So first past the post basically went one person, one vote. The majority would get the vote. As we know, that can be tricky, as you don't have to be a majority in order to get all the votes, and that kind of can pose a problem, as we can see here. So moving forward, the first round of votes that they had, Tudjman won 41.76% of the popular votes, followed by the SKH and the SDP party. And then we see that there were a second round of runoff votes that happened, where 214 seats were up for parliament. In addition to those seats, HDC won 98 more seats on their second round. And overall, the HDC party, which is the party of Tudjman, they garnered 205 seats out of 351 seats after the Croatian parliamentary elections were over. And generally, the HDC party fared well, where in both voting and in areas where Croatian representation was of an absolute majority. So we see that Franjo Tudjman was elected president with 40% of the votes, which garnered him 67% of the seats that they had available in the parliament, thanks to the first past the post system of elections that they had. And this kind of election galvanized political entrepreneurship of leaders like Franjo Tudjman, because it kind of utilized the ethnic national question and their impulses in Croatia. The campaign was also an issue of ethnic loyalty and heightened the panic of their national survival there. So his power kind of was fed into the budding paranoia and the nationalistic self-assertion on the part of Serbs in that region. And these symbolic fears fed into actually narratives crafted by other rival ethnic groups to kind of enhance their political legitimacy. This is actually peculiar, because if it was by popular system of voting and been proportional, then the HDC, even if they won 40% of the votes, they wouldn't be holding the majority. So that was something that helped him kind of use his ethnic rhetoric to help him win power. So as we saw, the system by communist parties kind of allowed Tudjman to win, and win by a huge margin. We also see that by the end, the HDC party, as they were elected into power in succeeding elections, they began to revise the electoral process in order for them to stay and maintain power for a very long time. So this kind of allowed his competitive or authoritarian ways, and he capitalized on the fear and resentment of ethnic cleavages between the Croats and Serbs and other issues to kind of push his electoral base, which was 85% Croats. And we can see that this kind of electoral process and the need to change it was not really looked at, and that let his political entrepreneurship take hold. Thank you.
I don't know how much time we have allotted for questions here, but the three of you should come up here and see Dr. Pearson.
Thank you for three well-conceived and impressive analyses. I have quick questions for Dalia and John, if I might.
Yeah.
And for Dalia, you mentioned that there's no reconciliation process that has been seen in the area. Has there been any kind of dialogue process? Have there been any kind of dialogue processes? Because we've seen at least dialogues at the grassroots level in places like Ireland, in places even like Palestine and Israel. Is anything going on for dialogues cross-ethnically in the communities that you were able to determine or see. And for John, an interesting comparison to Donald Trump, but would a better or more apt comparison be about Vladimir Putin? In the sense that we have a failed or semi-failing state that had been at one time quite successful, seemingly, then failing, then resurrected with a strong ultra-nationalist kind of component, taking advantage of other areas on the periphery and appealing to a base sense of nationalism in that way. And not inappropriate to talk about Trump, but I wonder about Putin in the sense that it's a little more ethnically similar in some respects.
So I guess I'll start. Former Yugoslavia did have a truth council. Like I said, it was not a reconciliation council, which is what I think is a differentiating factor in their truth. They functioned for 2 years, but no final report was given. So I think that there are efforts, and one of the things I noticed while we were there is that the new generation is not so concerned with a lot of these ethnic differentiations as the older generations were. We had the privilege of meeting so many classmates, many of which, they were like, we don't even ask anymore where you're from. We don't ask if you're Serbian, if you're Croatian, we don't ask. So I see the country, I see the region moving forward, but to establish some form of formal reconciliation, it's hard to say. That their truth council, I think, from what I understand, failed miserably in doing its job.
Well, to respond to your point about the comparison between Trump and Putin, I think there's definitely a comparison to be made using the framework that you established. I personally haven't done too much research about Putin and Russia and how he kind of, came to the position that he's in right now. I can say that based on the way you prefaced the question, there definitely are similarities there to be drawn. Of course, every situation is different. Like for example, in the case of Milosevic and Trump, Milosevic's actions, although him and Trump use very similar ways to build up their political stature, it's unlikely that the Trump presidency will result in an ethnic civil war in the United States of America. So, while there will be major political implications and economic implications, it's difficult to really say there's obviously points that can be made in connection between the two situations. I'm not really certain because of the limitations of my studies how much Trump and Putin have in common. I know that they are very good friends from what I understand. Yeah, so I do think you bring up a good point. It's definitely something I'd have to look more into though before I can speak further.
It's not a question as much as a comment. First of all, I want to compliment all of you. Mind you, John, particularly, you left me very unhappy and depressed, but that's anything that deals with Trump leaves me worried and depressed in terms of that. And to some extent, your paper also could have taken Trump as an example. I'm not asking you to have done those, because you chose research projects that, one, interested you and that you could get into. And once you get into them, you follow through, in a sense. And I think all three of them added a level of information. Having just traveled through, to be honest, a Viking River trip, which is a very socially kind of thing, it's interesting to see the presentations they made on the informational presentations on the boat. And we went through all 5 Balkan countries, which included Romania, and Serbia and Croatia. And it was interesting to see that Croatia came out the worst, I have to say that, in terms of presentations. I'm not saying necessarily the presenters always did that. I'm talking about what I heard and did. And a lot depended on World War II. And you didn't mention World War I and what happened in World War I. That was really a crucial issue, particularly between Croatians and Serbs, and then the follow-through. And just if you ever do this again, you have some time, you might want to just pick up a bit, at least in passing, because you cannot understand stuff until you know that 68% basically of the Serbians were killed in World War II, of the males between 18 and 65. And add that level of personal deaths, you understand why everything else follows. Because everybody had somebody they lost in grandparents, in the time you're looking at, and parents. And that's a crucial piece of how your personal, kinds of things. It wasn't an intellectual, this really was a personal, emotional kind of continuity on both sides. And so again, my compliments. It's not something,
So I was glad to hear Dalia say about the diminishing of sort of ethnic opposition and, rancor and so forth. And I actually think, maybe truth and reconciliation commissions serve some function, but the way these things are generally reduced, I think, is two ways. One is by having people who are from different ethnicities interact, so they learn they're just like us. And secondly, people realize there is no such thing as inherited guilt. We didn't commit those atrocities. So I think maybe that's what underlies this fact that maybe there's this optimism that you expressed in your answer to Fred.
But don't forget, in 1990, the spirit of Sarajevo was present. You know what that was? That was the Olympics. That was the great festivities that took place, that we are now one people, we're Europeans. We've overcome these historical animosities, and we have a new generation of Europeans. There was a tremendous outpouring of unity in those Olympics, and then 10 years later, the Olympic Stadium itself had been destroyed. Much of the libraries and cultural institutions in Sarajevo had been destroyed. And Sarajevo is the situation of World War I, of course, as well. It's continued to be with us. And how shaky these foundations of new thinking can be, or new generations can be. European identity, poof, it was a reversion to the old rural, anti-intellectual, and you pointed out, anti-cosmopolitan thinking that can resurrect itself under terrible conditions if allowed to do so with entrepreneurship. So it's some very telling points, but let's keep in mind that Spirit of Sarajevo was a great optimistic moment that just blew up.
Further thoughts, comments? Well, thank you all for being here.